over these many years, it's oftentimes been asked of those who have come, what is it that made you prevail? In other words, what is it that has allowed us to rise above the seeming failures, the tragedies, the traumas, the losses, the separations, the vicissitudes of life? And if we acknowledge this and perhaps give it form, could it be that this is what a talisman is? There is a reminder of that story of the great ruler Harun el Rashid. Now, Harun el Rashid was an enlightened monarch, and oftentimes he would disguise himself at night and go out to the coffee shops, into the squares, and roam the streets of his kingdom to see how his people were faring. And one evening, when he was wandering in the poor area of the city, he came to a laneway, and at the end of a laneway he espied a light. Now, all of the houses of that time were lit by lamps or candles, but this light seems to be greater to him than any lamp or candle that he'd seen in the windows of the houses that he'd passed. So he was curious. So he walked down the lane, and he came to the little hovel that was situated there, and he looked in the window, and sure enough, there on the table was a candle. But the light which emanated from it seemed to be much brighter than that which a candle could give. And then he saw the old man sitting at the table, and he was quietly chanting. Was he praying? Was he making affirmations? But the light that emanated from him was evident and bright. So Harun el Rashid, his curiosity getting the better of him, knocked on the door of this hovel, and the old man came to the door and welcomed him, as was the custom, and invited him in. Now the old man said, "I'm sorry, I have little to offer you, only the simple bread and cheese that I have for my own repast, but I gladly share it with you." Now, as Harun el Rashid was sharing the simple fare of this old man, he got into conversation with him and asked him what it was that he did. The old man said, "Oh, I'm a cobbler. I repair shoes in the town, and I make enough for my living." So after an evening of quiet conversation, Harun el Rashid left and said, "Could I visit you again?" The old man, of course, said yes, "At any time you are welcome in my simple abode." So Harun el Rashid went off, and he decided that he would test this man. So the very next day he put out a law that no cobblers were again allowed in this city. After several months, Harun el Rashid in his night wanderings, came again to the house of the old man. Again he was invited in, and after some time he asked him, "Well, what are you doing now that the king has said that you can no longer be a cobbler?" "Oh," said the old man, "I now carry water from the well to the homes of those who need." So, after again a conversation and the sharing of the simple fare with the old man, Harun el Rashid went off, not satisfied at all, and the very next day he put out the town criers who said that no one was allowed to hire water carriers in his city. And again, after several months, he came back to the simple house of the old man and asked him what was he doing now that he was no longer allowed to carry water. Old man said, "Well, some while ago I noticed a group of wood choppers going past on their way to the forest to gather wood. So I got myself an axe, and now I'm a wood chopper." So Harun el Rashid, again bent on testing this old man, decided, and the next day his soldiers went out, seeking out all the wood choppers in the city to dress them up as soldiers and become guards outside of his palace. Now, of course, amongst those who were gathered was the old man, who was dressed up in a uniform and given a very shiny sword and made to stand outside the Sultan's palace to be a guard. But the guards at the palace were only paid once every few months, and since he was just a new recruit, it would be some time before he had any means of putting food on his table. So Harun el Rashid, wondering how this old man got on, went out in disguise and came to his house. But in the meantime, the old man, not being able to earn any money, sold his shining sword and whittled himself a wooden sword. So when Harun el Rashid came to his house and asked him, "Well, how have you gotten on?" Dressed up as a guard, and so the old man told him, "Well, I sold my shining sword, and I whittled one out of wood." Harun el Rashid was quite intrigued by this. So a few days later, he made a plan, because there was a certain robber who was about to be beheaded. And of course, in those days, as is happening now, this was a public occurrence. So everyone was invited to this beheading. And of course, all the guards who were around the palace had to be at guard when the populace was there. And so when all the people were gathered and the robber was put up on the stand and the place where he was to be beheaded was prepared, Harun el Rashid ordered one of his viziers to go to the old man in his uniform and bring him up to the dais. He was to be the one who was going to chop off the robber's head. So when the old man was brought up to the dais, what could he do? He had to obey his monarch. But before he was about to fulfill this task, he shouted in front of all these people, "All of my life I've been a good man, not done any harm to anyone, and now I am asked to behead this man. So I say, please, if this man is guilty, may my sword lop his head immediately and painlessly. But if he is innocent, may my sword be turned to wood." And he took out his sword and held it up in front of the populace, who cheered. The robber was freed, and Harun el Rashid, bowing his head to the old man, elevated him from being his guard at the gate of his palace to being his leading advisor and vizier. Could it be? Let's ask first of all, what would you believe would be the talisman of the old man, taking it back from taking form as being something? What is it that this old man had that could be made into something tangible, called a talisman? What would be the talisman that would be formed out of that which this old man had?
I think he had numerous things. I think he had courage, I think he had persistence, I think he had patience, I think he had focus, he had belief in himself, he had lots of things that got him there.
Okay.
And skill.
Yes.
And an inner guide to tell him what to do.
Absolutely. So if we put ourselves in this place, we know that we have all of these things also. And if we acknowledge them, all of those qualities, acknowledge them, we too can form a talisman, isn't it? We too can form a talisman, just like the story the other day. But what's the vital thing here? We can acknowledge in ourselves, yes, I've got fortitude, I've got courage, I've got tenacity, I've got these. But how do we bring them together to make them a reality? Because in the process of the spiritual journey, we've stripped down an I, so we can't claim it, isn't it, as an ego thing. I've attained courage, I've attained power, I've this, I've that. There's no more I. So we can't make a composite out of these in an egoic sense. So this is the reason for having this talisman as a representation of it, just like the sheikh in the story the other day. So if we ourselves acknowledging all of this without an I, what talisman would we form? What would it be? The other day I brought this golden scarf and I said, this is my talisman. What did it represent in that? What is the representation for you of this? Talisman and what it means. What is it that you could present to the world, not as an I, but a representation, as the sheikh did? This is the receptacle of my power, the power of illumination. Stone. This is a challenge for us. But its purpose is to force us to acknowledge not a set of qualities, but something that is there for the world to see and experience. Not from any I or ego. Because would you say, I have courage, I have fortitude, I have knowledge, I have power? When we walk the spiritual path that's dismantled painfully through the vicissitudes, through the tragedies, traumas, anything that can claim, I did this, I am that. But the challenge still remains to acknowledge. And so, this talisman, what is it for you? What could it be?